Welcome to the Startup Grind.
So I'd like everybody to stand up, please, and put your hands together, hoot and holler, and let's give it up for Mr. Michael Labriola.
Yeah, we're good. We're live now.
Okay, let's do the clapping again. Let's do the clapping again.
Oh, we're not clapping again.
You guys are good sports. Thanks for working through that with us. So, Michael, how do you feel to have that welcome? How does it feel here to be in Michigan?
The first welcome or the second one?
Both. How do you feel?
No, they're both fantastic. I'm happy to be here. In fact, actually, I've spoken here a number of times before, and there's some friendly faces in the audience from previous presentations I've done. So it's nice to have caught up with a few people. But yeah, it's nice to be here.
Cool. So at Startup Grind, we're having this nice chat here. What was your experience growing up? How did you know you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
So, wow, that's really hot now. We're going to move that down just a little bit. All right, so it's one way or the other, apparently. Kind of like me, actually. So how did I know I wanted to be an entrepreneur? That's a great question. I think that it's less about knowing from the beginning that I wanted to be an entrepreneur and more about realizing that I wasn't completely content with the way things were working, that I felt like I had a specialized skill that I could bring to market and hopefully do something better for myself and build something. I've always been interested in how people relate, how organizations evolve, and so maybe, I don't know, I had some delusion that I could do it myself.
But if we go way back to like when you were a kid, were there any formative experiences, or did you have any entrepreneurs in the family, or anything like that?
Sure. So I guess there's a lot of them. Made it here, but as far as sort of familiar things, yes. So my father did a number of small businesses. In fact, when I was younger than I necessarily remember, he had his own business, which at one point he had actually he used to build custom racing engines when I was very young. But he had sold that, and he had gone in and worked for somebody else for a long period of time during my youth. And then about the time that I was in, I don't know, junior high or high school again, he decided to take the plunge again and go back into business for himself. So certainly that was an element that I always saw at various points in my life, the positives and negatives of it, I might add. So I apparently didn't heed that warning and moved forward anyway. But so those were certainly, parts of forming that idea. I probably had a few ideas of my own to, that I would do things, but, everyone does at one point or another.
Did you try any businesses growing up?
I don't know if I would call them getting far enough to be businesses, but, at various points in time, I thought that I would manage to sell a service or something that I could do. They were very short-lived, some days at a time. But yeah, there was probably miscellanea as I was growing up.
So then you grew up, you didn't die. And then you went to college and then went out in the work world?
Yeah, so I kind of did it a little bit in reverse, to be honest. Right after, I was already doing software, which is where I'm consulting in now. I was already doing a lot of software when I was in high school. And so I actually left high school and went into a summer, somewhere between an internship and a position as far as engineering went in software. I had a knack for it, so I actually turned it into a full-time gig very quickly and kept it while I went to college. So I was doing part-time work while I was starting in college. Went to college and then was coming back and working there at breaks and over summer and wherever I could. I was only at college for a couple of years before it just didn't really work for me. We were at different places. I got the letter that says so. But after I left, I went back and actually continued and moved up into a full engineering position. So by the time I was a couple years out of high school, I was in an engineering position working in sort of that world in a relatively small organization, maybe a 100-person company.
What were you working on then?
So back then, I did a lot of hardware and software, electronic engineering combined with computer engineering. And in particular, I was doing automated systems that would test microcontrollers and other sorts of boards in the system. So it was a process automation piece to try to improve efficiencies in areas of the company.
And what time frame was this?
This was, at this point, early to mid-90s, in that kind of range. and that kind of evolved into more things. But yeah.
And so you were working on this circuit boards and things like that, and somehow that led into the software world.
Well, yeah, they're interrelated. So from a perspective, when you're working on software, right, your software doesn't exist out in the ether. It has to run on something. So there's a lot of people who are content kind of staying at that level, and there's some of us who want to kind of know how it works all the way down. And I've always been somebody who kind of is intrigued across the stack of how things work. So while I started in software, I was working across those and actually became, for a little while, they were very integrated into the hardware and software aspects of it, and was so for a number of years in that position, which actually is what led me kind of out of it eventually, is I think I immersed myself in it for so long that when I finally decided I needed a change, I went for something completely different because I needed something completely different.
So what was it that? How did you know that you needed something completely different, and what was your thought process there?
Needing something completely different was the point in time where you wake up one morning and go, oh, crap, I have to go to work.
Nobody's ever felt like that, right?
Yeah, life's too short. It's not that there aren't hard days all the time wherever you work, but having a consistent feeling that where you're about to go and what you're about to do is just not where you want to be and not where you want to spend time. And there was nothing wrong. The company I worked with, they were nice enough people. We didn't always see eye to eye on things, but it was a combination of projects and culture and lots of things that just led it to being a really arduous day. And they were getting long, arduous days as product schedules were slipping and things were happening, and all of a sudden you're working later and later and getting there earlier and earlier, and yeah, at some point just reached a conclusion that maybe that wasn't where I wanted to be.
And so then what did you want to do?
Anything else at that time. However, I, in true, like, completely, needing a break sort of fashion, I made the decision that I was going to leave. So I decided, well, what am I going to do? I can go shop myself around for another opportunity. Or, at this point, I had been exposed to web and internet technologies when I was in college very early on, and I knew about them. And there was this, whole wonderful thing where AOL was shipping everyone 5,000 pounds of floppy disks a week, so the internet was starting to catch on. And companies were starting to kind of figure out that maybe there was a place to make some of this commercial. So I thought, well, let's see if there's a game to be had in trying to commercialize some of those things and take advantage of that bit of momentum someone else was creating for me and see if I could capitalize on it. So it wasn't even so much a rigorous plan that this is where I wanted to go, so much as it was this is something I think I could work with, and the market's presenting an opportunity, so let me try and seize it.
So then what'd you do?
Well, to be honest, I decided I was going to make that change, so I started at that time, and this was probably almost a year out before I necessarily left the position. I did the double time thing. I worked during the day from 8 till 5 or 6 as an engineer, and then I went home and worked from 6 till midnight or so as my thing as an entrepreneur, and did both of those in an effort to lead up to the point where I was, had this kind of trajectory where I'd go out on my own, which, by the way, didn't work because eventually, to be frank, I got really irritated and left before my trajectory was complete. But I callously jumped into a full-time career, now realizing that I was really going to have to make it or I wouldn't be paying rent, and that was a fantastic motivator.
So you had a job and you were working too much at it, and so it was bogging you down, so you decided to start a company where you were consulting?
Yes. Effectively, I decided that things were too stressful and there was too much work going on, so the way to make it more easy on myself would be to have not one boss, but clients and a boss, and not one job, but two, and in addition to paying my bills, create some more. Yes, that was basically my plan. Now, when you say it, it does not sound nearly as well thought out.
And when you were doing that, how are you servicing your clients while you're also at your job?
So I was fortunate to be in this new career and be able to capitalize on wonderful misconceptions that everyone had and still has in some ways of what technology was supposed to mean. It meant that most people who had a technical person at their job, it was the Saturday Night Live skit of move when you sat down at the computer. There was no expected interpersonal relationship with somebody who was doing technology for you at the time. So I was able in many cases to communicate via email, things like that, and capitalize that. I also wasn't necessarily dishonest with my initial customers that I was doing this part-time, which I think helped too, so that kind of set the expectation of what I was doing. But I managed to deliver on time for them, and that's what they mainly cared about, and that got me started.
So it was honesty, and then having some time freedom. It sounds like where you could schedule in when you were able to work at both jobs.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent. It wasn't a lot in the way of time freedom, to be honest. A lot of it was just doing my best to manage expectations and appropriate smoke screens in order to get me through until I could get out of there for the day and return calls in the last business hour that someone else had.
And then these side jobs, you were making microcontrollers and things for people?
No, most of the side job stuff once I started going was really getting more towards internet and web. You can do contract, but in those areas where you're talking about big microcontrollers or systems like that, it tends to be so involved that you don't get a lot of part-time or small things. They're very long projects. They're years long at a time. So no, this was more starting off with smaller projects, web-based things of that nature.
And what year was this?
So we're probably 95-ish, 96-ish, somewhere in that range.
And so you were writing web apps. And what was the web like in 1995?
Well, it was starting to grow, right? But like you go back and, the anecdote I think I told you earlier, which is still fun, is that Yahoo calls itself a directory, and the reason was it was great because Yahoo was a directory because there were only like 51 websites, so you could just go there and click on the category you wanted, and there was websites listed. It was really traumatic when it scrolled the 2 pages. So this was kind of the state of things. So it was a very simple web thing. My first web pages had gopher links for anyone who knows what that means anymore. But this is how things worked. So the very first pages are things that a customer would want to put online. And it was a single page, tiny little thing with a little bit of information and some advertising. I'll never forget having one customer, just anecdotally for a moment, who was very, very angry because after we finished their web page, they weren't on the top of Yahoo's directory. And they were some tiny little vertical blind a place in this little storefront somewhere in a suburb. But they were very upset that they weren't number one in the world for their blind manufacturing because they spent their couple $100s to go to the internet. But those were the types of things that I was doing in the beginning, and it was a way to kind of start edging into that space.
So, to recap a little bit and then move this forward. So you were at your job and you had you didn't like it, so you wanted to have another income stream. You wanted to be your own boss, make your life easier, and you had a revenue target. But before you hit that revenue target, you decided, hey, this place sucks. I'm just going to leave.
Something like that, yeah.
And then everything was great because you left, and then you had all kinds of money pouring in with all these clients knocking on your doors.
Absolutely, it was nothing but a stress-free existence at that point. It was fantastic, really. No, so after having left my primary revenue stream for a projected revenue stream that certainly wasn't on target, I worked really, really hard and got really good at budgeting to try to cut things down and to build. But yeah, it was those were grindish days, if you will, of trying to make it through. But to an extent, there was also sort of a, as I like to call it, my deep and insurmountable personality flaws that kind of led me towards in continuing to engage and maybe doubling down when it got hard and continuing to push through.
What were some of the techniques and strategies you used when it gets hard? And did you ever think about quitting? What kept you going?
It's weird. It's funny you mentioned that. Not at this period. I never thought about quitting, but it wasn't. It wasn't that I had some large goal or knew what it was going to develop into. It's that I thought I could turn it into a viable revenue stream for me and give myself some of the things I wanted. Did I ever think about quitting? Oftentimes I thought that it would be much, much easier, and oftentimes it would be much, much easier to have gone and worked for somebody else and to simply take home that paycheck and be good at that. But there was something that was attractive about not only the freedom, freedom's a weird word when you're an entrepreneur, the freedom of being able to do what you want, but in some ways, developing what I considered skills for myself and being able to hunt for projects and things that were going to develop what I considered to be relevant next. So if I kind of had a sense of where I thought industry or people was going, I could pick a project that would kind of, or try to court a project that would kind of get me there. So it was also a learning experience for me, and it was something that gave me the opportunity to continue to learn in directions I wanted to go. So at that point, no, I never thought about quitting. I probably should have. I didn't.
And you say it's because of one of your personality flaws?
Absolutely, one of my personality flaws. There are many, many times that I would have been much smarter to have taken an off-ramp, but I guess that I've stuck through it, and there's good things that come out of that. There's also tons of things that are bad about that, but I'm trying not to pass all those on to my daughter, but we're working on those. For the most part, I think it served me okay.
And you said when you left, you had some projected revenue, and you didn't quite hit that projected revenue, but then you said really quick you got good at budgeting and
yeah, that
things were smooth
projected revenue
sailing.
was really simple. It was like, how much is rent? How much would I like to eat? There are some basic things, and it turns out you can vary those a lot with a little bit of work, and you need to occasionally. Actually, I think the way I put it before was that the first 29 or so days of being an entrepreneur, all on my own, were fantastic. It was just that terrible part when the bills started coming in that all of a sudden the whole plan was falling apart.
So day one you quit, or day one you start your new company, and you feel great. You feel like you're top of the world. You're free. You can do whatever.
Something like that. There was a little bit of mindfulness. I think at that point I was more worried about, okay, so I got to find projects, I got to do these things, where I'm going to go, et cetera. But I wasn't necessarily doing all that budget math just yet.
And then 29 days later, you felt different?
29 days later, I was budgeting actively on how things would go from there.
Is there anything that you would have done differently during that time, or if anybody's thinking about leaving, what they should do, day one or in the first 4 weeks?
So everyone's experience is going to be different, right? But obvious things would be for me is that it would have been probably better and smarter to not be quite as impulsive and have held on to where I thought I would have had a good either revenue stream and or a fair amount of capital built up so that I could have made it through a period of time without worrying. So those are, smart things. This is, even though it often happens this way, jumping into things and being an entrepreneur, especially when you're small, should not necessarily be governed by impulse. There's my first takeaway right there. Impulse, probably not your business plan.
So then at this point, it sounds like you were a single person.
I was, fortunately. It would have been very, very hard to feed anyone else on that.
I was thinking in terms of your employees, it was just you.
Oh, yes, that too.
And is that still the case today?
No, it's not just me anymore. So from that time, it was just me. And I built up quickly in a couple dumb ways.
A couple dumb ways?
Yeah, a couple dumb ways.
Okay.
So one of the first best ways that, the first dumbest way I could think to build up was to think I could take a partner on, because that would make perfect sense. Then there would be two of us that didn't get paid, and we'd both have half a share of nothing. It turns out that didn't last for very long, because especially if you are courting someone else to bring into a business, they aren't necessarily sharing that vision and as motivated nor as willing to starve themselves in the beginning of a process. So all of those things actually don't work, and you're also giving up both equity and a control factor, which is part of it too. If you've got a vision, it's not that yours is always the right one, but giving it up too early on can be a problem as well. So that was one dumb way I tried to grow initially. And actually, to be fair, I tried that way twice. It didn't work out either time, but with different people. I did get to different levels. So one time it was a couple people, and we succeeded to a degree, and then I built back up and had taken on a couple. One other partner, and then over time, I had a couple key employees, and I thought that one of the really great ways to bring everyone together would be to have them be partial owners and things like that as well. And it did work to a degree, and we built up.
So the idea there was every time you hired somebody, they would have a piece of equity in the company?
It wasn't that idea. It was key people, but it was even still probably stretched a little thin in doing so. But from early on, I recognize that there's things I do well and there's things I don't, right? And so part of my courting others has always been to try to find people who made up for where I'm weaker at things and who could be mindful of the things that I wasn't. And I think that's a good strategy. I'm not sure that I would have always done it. Wait a minute, I'm going to blame Nick for all this. I'm not sure I would have always done it by taking on partners as I did that time. But overall, finding people that make up for your weaknesses is not a half bad thing. Sorry, go ahead.
So it sounds like, did you have looking back on that time, do you think it was the right strategy? That it was a good strategy to find a partner, and it was maybe problems in the execution?
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps also, to be honest, bringing somebody in or building up an environment like that requires a certain amount of structure, infrastructure, requires the ability to, I don't know, manage how things are going to work when you disagree. And I'm not sure that the business organization or thought processes behind it were far enough along to support that, is one piece for sure. So I put a lot of that on me. Second,
That's like having been through those experiences, you learned some of the things that didn't work that you didn't know without having had those experiences?
yeah, I mean, there's many, people learn many different ways. I seem to learn mostly by either failing or butting my head against a wall. Not for lack of trying other solutions, it just seems to be the one that works for me. But so in this case, building up and letting people come into this but without infrastructure, very quickly became a problem and it became apparent. Now I was fortunate that some of those people tried to evolve some of that infrastructure, but it was a difficult time. You're entrepreneurial, you're trying to get things started, you're having clashes of their personalities. Those are all to be expected, but it can also become a drag on where things are going as well.
And so it sounds like you had some partnerships, some things went okay, but others didn't, and you kind of had some ups and downs, it sounds like, during the next, from 95 to maybe 2005
Yeah, it's about
or
2000,
something like that?
2001, to be honest. Things went, ebbed and flowed a little bit, but got up to the point where we were maybe, now granted, a lot of this was like, summer, college, we were still pretty young at this point, but brought into the point where we were about a 14-person company with, a lot of summer help, things like that were coming in. But, the median age of everyone in the organization was probably 20. So we're not talking a fully vetted, rooted, established thing. But, it was very active. We were very encouraged in accomplishing a lot. And actually, given where we were and given the roots of what we had come from and how we built it up, we're starting to get some named clients. We're starting to become more interesting in what we did. And there were good things about it.
Those named clients, you were in Chicago, or were these some names that people in the audience would recognize?
So I think one of the first big named clients we got at that era was we had worked a lot with the American Medical Association and specifically the American Medical Association Insurance Agency. Some of those were some of the named clients. There's also, we did a lot of work with nonprofits back in that era. So.
And for getting what client did you say was that first one?
I said the AMA was like one of the ones I mentioned.
Did you target that company, or did that happen by accident, or?
It was, they were looking for a vendor, and we had seen that they were kind of going through an RFP process. And I would say that we did our best to ensure that that we went at that point we sought them out, right? So after we saw it, we said, yes, this is a client we'd like. So what can we do to get ourselves ready for this client? And that included ensuring that we did our homework on them, that we figured out what they needed, that we were put our best foot forward on the experience we had, did our best to craft our message in terms of ways they would understand. And ultimately, I think we were probably the underdog, but managed to get the contract, which was great for us.
Why was that contract important for you?
It's sometimes you need a win, right? In the sense that little things are fine, but there's a motivational factor around getting people focused on something and accomplishing it or overcoming a goal. And so getting to that point where you had that sort of named client that everyone could focus behind and, for lack of a better term, people could go home and tell their families and someone else would recognize one of those names, those are important moments when you're trying to build something.
Did that help in other ways too? Did that change your business?
I don't know that it changed our business. I don't know that particular client was revolutionary to the way the business changed. I think it was more a motivational aspect than anything else.
This is still around the 2001 timeframe?
This is probably late 90s. We're kind of on that, ascension.
And so you lived through the dot-com bubble and burst.
I used to put on my resume that I lived through the dot-com era and kept my sense of humor. Was an accomplishment of mine. Because yes, that was an interesting time, right? And that was probably where we were. We weren't a dot-com company, but it was interesting. Pretty much everyone we did business with would get acquired every third day. So it was, one of those things where it was like, oh, we're working with this company who's, gone 2 days later because they've been acquired, or our peer who was acquired, or the company down the street we were working with who's actively trying to be acquired. I mean, that was basically what it was like to be in those times. It's a fun side note, half of the companies that were being acquired, which is not surprising, looking at, never actually went anywhere because all they did was sell to each other. So all their revenue streams looked great, but there was never actually any real money, but it was great balance sheets. So all those things happened, but we worked with a lot of those people, and we also worked with a lot of other organizations. And when that dot-com bubble burst, while we weren't the dot-com, certainly that was our client base, right? I mean, that was a big portion of the people we were selling to every day that were suddenly out of cash and out of investment money.
What kind of impact did that have on your business if all your clients are dying?
It wasn't great. It wasn't positive at all, as a matter of fact. It was great, it just wasn't positive. So that definitely, cut things quite a bit. Now, at the time, like I said, a lot of the folks that we were working with were college. So I think I kind of saw the trajectory and that things weren't going where I wanted to, and we were going to have to scale back some. But we had enough capital, we had enough things to kind of make it through till a lot of people were able to kind of move back into college. And some of the other folks that we were working with were kind of the opinion that they were either done with technology or moving on, especially after the dot-com burst. So we were able to bring things down to a much smaller size without really having to kick anyone out the door for the most part, which was nice, because I'm concerned. People who work with me are important to me, right? I wanted to give them the best opportunities possible. So, a lot of them were able to go on to other things. But yeah, we pulled way back. We brought down to, depending on how you counted, 2 or 3 people at that point and re-centralized on sort of a really core, small, tiny market.
2 or 3 people from what size?
From 14.
And you were lucky because you knew all these people and they were your friends and you didn't have to fire anybody?
They weren't all friends, but there were transitions or people going back. And again, some people just, to be in that era and to have watched the technology thing go up and everyone bet their hopes on it and then go, there are just people I know that I worked with then who have never worked in technology again. They were disillusioned, they were done, and they left. And that was all there was to it. So there were a couple people I had to exit, but it wasn't everybody. It wasn't going and pulling. It wasn't the large company announcement of hey, how's everybody? We're leaving. But it was unfortunately going to a much smaller base than where we were.
So you did have to fire 2 people?
A couple, yeah.
Was that the first people you'd ever fired, or had you done that before?
Yeah, it was the first people I'd ever really fired. There was one person before that point that I had to fire earlier that year, and it always sucks. I still hate it. I still hate having to fire people, although I recognize what's sometimes the necessity and value of it, but it's still, it's never a happy thing for me. I don't really like kicking people out the door. I don't really, even people who I think are doing a really bad job, you don't want to crush somebody. Flip side is, and probably overshare on these things, but I'm also, when I do have to fire somebody, I'm really, really honest to both a positive and negative fault here of telling them why it didn't work, because I do think, just like me, if I get fired or something, I want to know what I can do better. So it's not always well received, but I'm happy to tell everybody exactly why, so for better or worse.
And you feel that firing people is necessary, did you say?
Absolutely necessary. So I know that can sound harsh, but as a small business, there's the 2 most important things I think you can do in the beginning are be extraordinarily careful about who you hire and be extremely ready to understand that you might have to fire. You don't have buffer. There's no giant payroll infrastructure that's going to support somebody that's going to not be able to be functional and hang around for months, years at a time. There's no middle to get lost in where you can just barely do enough of your job to hang around, right? It's, especially when you're working small, you're trying to build something and you're trying to quickly, not even quickly, but just grow something at all. Everyone's an important part of that. And so if you hire somebody and they're not the right person, that is a huge impact. The time you took to onboard them, train them, work with them, and then ultimately have to go through the resolution is huge. So the first thing is that I'm crazy about hiring, like just absolutely mad about who I hire because I don't want to have to go through that second part, which is that when you do make a mistake, you've got to act on it. As uncomfortable, as terrible, as unfortunate as it might be, ultimately the choices are that you can help this, you can ask this person to leave and hopefully they're going to, and maybe even help find them something that they can go on to. But if you keep in there, you're not only compromising their ability to go and find something they might be happy at, but you're probably going to take yourself down with them, and then there's going to be lots of us out of work instead of one of us out of work. So it's as unfortunate as it is, and I wish it never had, all these sorts of things that you can say along with it. End of the day, hiring and firing decisions are huge for a small company, just huge.
So your company at this point in time, it's just after 2001 or so. You've had some good successes. You've had some named clients. You're feeling pretty good. A staff of 14. You feel like you've built something, and then all of a sudden it goes down to 2 or 3 people. What are you feeling at that point?
Awesome, incredible relief. Because to be honest, at that point, the stress of the dot-com burst, all of these things happening, people exiting, what are we going to do? How are you going to make payroll? All of that going away and coming down to like 3 people, and it was like, oh wait, I still have a client base, and all I have to do is like pay a couple salaries. Yeah, that was like the best thing ever. After I got past all the really uncomfortable parts of that, the next year actually probably started putting me back together into a place where I could really approach things well again. So it was still one of the best things that could have happened.
So it felt really good to be at 3 people, and then you decided to rebuild a larger team?
It felt fantastic to be at 3 people where we were making ends meet and things were going well. But more specifically, I had learned a lot. So now it was time to start playing again, but to try to put it together differently, to try and correct some of the mistakes I made before, figure out where there were problems and faults, and then start building something that could be more sustainable. It's kind of hard, it's a house of cards thing, right? Like I feel like with the 14, maybe we got to here, but it was a house of cards. And so maybe you could have built a couple more layers on it, but at the end of the day, it wasn't stable. So now we were back down, and yeah, it might be looked at as a failure, and I'm good with that. Failing's fine. But you come back to the point now where it's like, all right, now I have a chance, and if I want to build something again, what do I have to get in place first? What are the things I really need this time in order to start scaling up? And that was kind of the difference of that next time.
What were some of those things? Are there any things that you could share that you felt you needed that you think might be other people in this room who are building their companies?
Sure, and some of it'll probably emerge as we talk, but one of the things that was very important to me is recognizing what I'm not good at, right? And probably I have a big issue on kind of priorities and conflicting priorities. I'm a consultant. I'm trying to work for my customer, which means that I have to personally put my customer first and make sure that they are the ones that are getting all my time. How can I also be doing the business of keeping my organization running and doing the things that I'm supposed to do in my organization, which is also supposed to be a priority, if my priority is also my client? Inherently, I've set up a conflict. I've set up a conflict where I can't do the 2 things that are necessary at the same time because they're different jobs. So what would happen in the old days? Well, I'd get really busy with a client and they'd be very satisfied, but I wouldn't get around to invoicing somebody for 2 months, which was really problematic from a cash flow perspective, right? It turns out that employees are really interested in getting paid all the time. And so, those things are not something that you can do. You can't look for expansion. You can't look for what you're doing wrong. You can't make sure you're spending the right amount of time on a contract. You can't do all of those things and at the same time try to make sure that every emergency that comes up for a client you're dealing with well. So I found myself always pulled in 2 directions. So starting over again, one of the things I always knew, and I wasn't sure what form this would take, but I always knew that it was really important to have somebody else who was rooted and was honestly different than me, but was able to ensure that we started focusing on some of those core things from the beginning and then kind of build up from there. So
It sounded like that was something you recognized early on where you were trying to bring in a partner, even in the early stages, to do the things that you knew you weren't the best at, so you could focus on your best.
To be self-critical, honestly, the early days of bringing in a partner were, in my mind, more about horizontal staffing in the sense that I was looking for more people like me, to an extent, maybe slightly different skills, but more people like me, and I was always thinking technical. I want people to fill in these technical gaps. When I started trying to rebuild things back up into a consulting organization this time, it wasn't just technical gaps anymore I was trying to fill. It was organizationally. How do I build an organization that's going to work? There's a million different authors who have a million different opinions on things, but there's a few things every once in a while that have resonated. And one of them, for me, was the idea of understanding what value you personally can deliver to your organization. All right? So I am very, very good at being a consultant. I'm very, very good at delivering technical solutions. I'm extremely good with my client and helping them understand and develop things. That's a list of things I can do best for my organization. If I'm focused 100% on things that I'm exceptional at, I'm doing a good thing for my organization. If I'm focused 50% on those and I'm focused 50% on things that I'm only mediocre at, why am I spending 50% of my time on things I'm mediocre at? It would make much more sense to find somebody else who's really good at those things and to work with them. And that's kind of the philosophy I've tried to follow since then, is looking at what I can do to build and to do what I can best for my organization. I'm not saying I've always succeeded at that. I got many more failures than successes on all of these things, but that's what I've always aimed for. So some of it was hiring, right, and bring people in. And in fact, some of the people that got hired, kind of found their place in the organization. But to make a difference in kind of stability, or what happened is that bringing someone on who then began focusing and paying attention to those sorts of things allowed us to then begin to get into the point where we became a very comfortable and conservative growth pattern, but very comfortable, and became a more cash-heavy organization that could do things, and things I would have never dreamed of doing on my own, because frankly I would have been solving a client problem and not invoicing, right?
So you hired some employees to work for you, and that helped you grow the company a lot?
I think that was some of those hires were extremely key to getting from 2 people up, to starting to make that happen. So yeah, some of it was hires, and then, having had more before and knowing the consequences, I was really very cautious when hiring in the beginning again. And it went slow. The 2 to 4 to 5 people was a few-year process. I was very slow at first. But then it got to the point where things felt stable. We were starting to get bigger clients, longer-term projects. Things were feeling good. But now, this time, adding staff wasn't as scary. It wasn't that same thing, because it felt like the core was stable. There was something we could really work with.
And around that time, did you begin exploring another partnership?
So a little bit later, right? So this is probably, what I'm talking about now is maybe about 2004, where we really started hiring and developing. We probably got up to about that same mark again, maybe about 14 people. And then in 2006 to 7 range, I was speaking a lot and doing a lot of presentations. I've written several books on the technology that I've worked with, and did a lot of presentations. And there was another person I knew from the community who was also an author. In fact, I'd met them doing one of the books. And they had a consulting company as well. And so at one of the conferences, they sort of approached me and said, well, so what do you think about the idea? And I had all sorts of ideas about it, some positive, some negative. But we explored it, and we went further with it. It was a little bit scary, to be honest, for a number of reasons. First of all, I had been in these partnership situations before, and I knew what the complexity of that really spelled out. But there was an opportunity. This firm had a presence and a name that was more recognizable than our own, but we were bigger than they were at that point. So we kind of had different things. We had more capability of delivering. They had access to key clients and certain names that I think would have worked really well. So after a lot of back and forth, and a lot of hard-fought decision-making, in 2007 we decided to merge with them. And in doing so, we only increased the size of the organization very modestly, a few people at that point. But what we did was we opened a bunch of new markets that we could really start exploring for ourselves, that we weren't just going after, but we actually had a little bit of a foothold in. We had references, we had people, we had somebody that we knew, there was connections that we could actually work with. And so that was a big part of what 2007 did to help put us on an increased trajectory a little bit.
So you had a larger company, but they had a brand with some nice clients, but they weren't able to capture, they weren't able to fully service those clients, it sounds like?
Yeah, I think to some degree. I also think that they were just a little bit, smaller organization, and a little bit more used to being maybe where I had been a little bit before, which was a few people to working together. And there's a big difference between a couple people working together in a company. And it's important sometimes to know which one you are. I think at this point they were on the verge of being a company, but they were maybe still in that we're a few of us working together. And the combination of merging those two together actually worked quite nicely for everyone involved.
And then when you merged, you were the head of the merged organization?
That was so now you're getting into the difficult parts. All right, so that was, to be candid, some contention, right? As I think Nick had put it earlier, the 3 people in this are all big names and big personalities. And so there was some question.
Wait, so can you back up? Because I thought you were talking about a merger, you and another company?
No, so us and this company that we're merging.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone involved being fairly large personalities of the people. There were 2 people that were in charge of the other company. So there were fairly large personalities involved. So there was some contention on how this was all going to work. And so we backed up again, and it actually got to this point where, which we'd already put in place, which was that business should be really a little bit separate from consulting. But now it was even more important to me, in the sense that as a consultancy was going to grow, as this was going to happen, we couldn't really have 3 people who were consultants, whose primary job was to be technical and to service customers making the business decisions. So with a little bit of convincing, we all agreed to step back, all of the more senior partners, and promote one person to be the president of the organization. And so on a day-to-day basis, the organization is run by the president. And at year end, we can vote our shares, and if we really think that person's doing a bad job as the board, we can fire them, we can do something. But on a day-to-day basis, I report to that person. I do what they tell me to do, because their job is to make sure that business succeeds day to day, and my job is to make sure that we have technical successes and work with clients well. So part of that process was to get my ego the hell out of the way, and to understand that I wasn't going to succeed on my own. I wasn't going to succeed battling other people, and that several of us battling for that position was even to be worse, and that sometimes what you really need to do, again, is to delegate that very significant responsibility to someone you trust, focus on what you're good at, and ensure that things go forward.
So it sounds like you're saying that you brought in somebody to be your own boss, that you still own the company, but somebody else tells you what to do?
Absolutely.
Can that really work? I mean, if you want to do something, like if you want to go to a conference and your boss says, no, you can't go, don't you just say, well, screw it, I'm going to go anyways, this is my company, I'll do what I want.
One could probably do that once. And then you'd either be without a president or without a company. No, that's happened. That very thing has happened. There was a conference I wanted to speak at last year, and I presented it, and they said, no, it makes no business sense. It's absolutely ridiculous, and there's no reason that we'd spend that budget to send you to there. And I agreed. Didn't really matter if I agreed, but I agreed. So I took some vacation days because I felt strongly about going and I flew myself out there with my miles on my vacation, and I went. But it wasn't a company function, and you know what? 100% right. It shouldn't have been. But that's the thing. From my perspective, where I was at, if I'm only thinking about it in terms of what I want to do in technology, yeah, I'd have a great temporary funding organization to make my life really interesting, right? I'd be able to fund some really great successes and play Batman for like an hour or something. But at the end of that, it would all fall apart. So the point is, yes, there's somebody there that I may own a large portion of the company, but they're my boss. And they're going to make the decisions because that's what I want. It's more important than ego to have somebody there who's minding that every day and to make sure that that's going to go forward. That's critical.
So it sounds like that's really working well for you. I mean, since he said you couldn't go to the conference and you didn't go, it must be that you...
That's your one example of how it's working well? I think it's...
I mean that structure where he's the boss. Did that really propel your company forward? Was that a game changer for you?
I think it is. I think, since that time right now, and it changes, it flows a little bit, but we're in the mid-20s as far as a consulting organization goes, as far as people, and that's where we actually wanted to be. In fact, actually with some planning, we kind of said that without major changes, we really didn't, we're conservatively willing to grow up to about 30 people, but infrastructure and culturally, that's about the highest we wanted to be right now. So we're right in actually our sweet spot of where we were hoping to be. And I think it's actually worked quite well. We've been very successful in the sense of promoting our name, and at the same time be able to be very comfortable, be able to bring on people, do things we wanted to do as an organization, go after and have the ability to try to go after new markets and capture things when we saw. And I think a lot of it works because of the fact that we're now being driven by someone who is certainly listening to and interacting with what the technical aspects of what our business mean, but again is focused on what the good of the business would be as opposed to just what the technical aspect would be.
And so now we're at about present day in your story, and it sounds like things are going well, and you have big clients like American Express, I think, is one of your clients, and the MLB.
I was just actually, since you were kind of going in order and just said present day, I was wondering when we were going to talk about the future. It's like if I could do a retrospective.
That's
for
coming
you.
right next.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of different named clients now, and that's great, right? We've done a lot of pieces for a lot of big organizations. Some of them, we can use their names. By the way, that's one of the trickiest parts of being a consultancy and small, is that you're so excited when you get your first named client, and none of them will let you use their name. So it's just this giant double-edged sword of now it's really exciting because I have this client and I can't tell anybody. But we get to work on really cool and important things now. So I get to say things like, well, I can't tell you who we did work for, but there was this large, sort of international sporting competition in London that we were able to work on the streaming media solution for and ensure that all went off. You can say things like that, but yeah, we get to work on more and more interesting projects. We get to work on these things and actively, and maybe this is it, right? When you're first starting out a lot, you can try to plan, but you're a bit reactive. You really are always trying to, it's great when the next customer comes in or you land something, but you tend to be more reactive. I think the goal is over time is that you try to stick a little bit more, you get to the point where you can be a little more planned. You can try to say, no, I want to go after customers like this. This is who we would like to be. This is where we'd like to go. And I think that's probably the biggest and coolest shift that happens anywhere in the process is when you actually realize you feel like you planned this as opposed to it just happened to you.
And say you're talking about planning now and where you want to go, and what do you see?
We are going to talk about the future. Awesome. Where do I see things going?
Where do you want to go?
Okay, so that's interesting, right? Here's something I haven't succeeded at, and there are, again, many, but here's something I haven't succeeded at. Right now, still, even though it's better than it ever has been, and many, many things in the organization go off without my involvement now, I'm still involved in a lot of the day-to-day. So I'm still bouncing between projects, I'm still doing things. And that's good because I want to be, but I also have to be to an extent. So I think the way that I'm gonna hit that next check mark of where I consider it to be successful is that I go there purely because I want to, but that every day everything runs regardless if I'm there, because now I feel like I've made that's my next transition, right? Of the point of yes, I'm here because I want to be, but it's not because I absolutely have to be for things to run. And it's better than it's ever been on that. But I still feel, and maybe it's just me, maybe everyone else there would tell me I don't need to be there at all, but I still feel like it takes a little bit of me being there every day, and that's still, it's not a bad thing, it's just something I think that means I'm not quite where I want to be yet.
That's that next level of maturity is where it runs without you.
Yeah, and again, I've spent a lot of time growing and working with the people that we have that have become more senior, that have grown up through the organization and worked. We tend to keep people a really very long time. People tend to work there and will grow with the organization. So I think there's great people there. I love the people I work with. I really do. I know that gets said a lot, but there's a combination of camaraderie, absolutely ridiculous level of humor, and a open hostility, which is great at all times, and really actually contributes pretty well to the team dynamic. So I feel in many ways that the people there now more, can certainly run most things. I'm just waiting for that last step of everything.
So you're close.
Maybe.
So actually at this time, we want to involve you. And I know some of the people in the audience have consultancies or are building out consultancies or have jobs and they want to build out a consultancy. So if you guys want to queue up over here, we'll take questions for Michael.
Maybe I've covered everything and nobody wants to hear me talk anymore.
Yeah, up once, everybody. Don't run a call at once. But anybody from the audience who has questions can come over here, and then I'll repeat the question for Michael. And while we're doing that, I heard that you have a lot of Nerf guns at your office.
There's an armory. Should we ever be invaded by creatures that are in fact susceptible to Nerf toys, you want to be at my office. We're covered.
Who's the best? Who's the sharpshooter at the office?
It's really weapon dependent. I'm known for causing a lot of rash destruction.
To people's eyes?
Not to people's eyes necessarily, but occasionally someone may have gotten hit in the back of the head with a missile, or things of that nature. But it's not ridiculous.com like there's Nerf guns everywhere, because right now those are slightly out of vogue and it's Matchbox tracks. But it changes. We do have, and I don't remember the name, but there is actually a Digital Primates YouTube channel, because a lot of my employees bought those really long Matchbox tracks, and they bought cars that have cameras in them. And so you'll see cars flying around the office and going through loops, and there's on a YouTube channel. And you know what? If that gets everybody through their day in a hard project, I am all about it.
Cool. Well, we have a brave soul in the audience. Reed.
Yeah, I figured help you out a little bit. I don't know how long you were going to have to go with that, but I do have a question for you. Talking about the selecting a partner or hiring employees, what techniques would you use in selecting a partner? Or also, a second part, whenever you're hiring new employees to add to your organization?
Okay, so a few things. Let's actually, we'll talk, I guess I'll hit it in two parts, okay? First of all, partner. The most important thing I can think of is that you need to get past your natural bias to choose someone like yourself. In fact, it's a hiring bias that almost everybody has. People tend to like people who are like them. You feel a little more comfortable. You get, you get in the room with them. Everything is good, and so you've decided that like this person's pretty good, and you begin to overlook faults and everything else because they're a lot like you. So one of the most important things, if you're talking about anyone who's going to be your peer, is to look for people who complement you, that you think you can work with, but who are different than you. You need people with a different perspective. I would screw up a lot more than I already do if I didn't have people who were telling me I was an idiot, a lot. So that's what I want. Now, hiring in general, I'm intense about this. And so when we're looking to bring somebody new into the organization, it's a long process for us, but a lot of it is understanding how, as best I can, how somebody thinks and what they're going to work with. I am so much less concerned. I have to tell you, to be honest, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway. I haven't looked at a resume in forever of somebody I was going to hire. There are other people in the organization who've at least made sure that they seem somewhat competent, but I am so much more interested in sitting down in a room and talking to somebody and understanding a little bit about how they think. And I do that through combinations of questions and sometimes a little whiteboard exercise or something. But I'm so much more interested in learning how they think than what's on that piece of paper. Resumes are bloated, resumes lie, resumes do tons of things, and I could make myself sound like an astrophysicist for a few minutes if I wanted to. But the point is that all of that stuff's there and good, but I've met people who have incredible resumes who I would never want to work with because they don't have what it takes to develop it, and I've met people who have no experience whatsoever who are fantastic. So I think part of the hiring thing for me is to have multiple perspectives. So not just me. It has to be multiple people that actually, assuming you're working in an organization that has it, that think that, yes, this is someone I want to work with, and multiple different people, right? So again, don't surround yourself with people that are all like you and then all of you collectively decide this is the next you. And then in addition to that, come at it from different perspectives. Have somebody who's responsible for really understanding whether this person fits into the job, either technically or some other sense, and then another person who's maybe understanding if this person is going to fit long-term culturally, company vision, things like that, and divide that. Almost every one of our interviews, or when we actually get a candidate to an interview, works as in a few of us in a room, we talk, we do a little bit of exercise and thinking, they go, three of us talk, we figure out where we're at, what we think of each one, and honestly, it's not even just up to me. I could be very much overridden at the initial level of like, no, this person's really good. But the one thing I will not do anymore, and I've made this mistake in the past, there's nobody that gets hired that I haven't met. There's nobody that gets hired that I haven't had a chance to sit down and have a conversation with, and that I will believe will ultimately be a cultural fit. Because those are really important things. Cultural friction is really hard in an organization. So anyway, if that helps, there's a few of my things.
So cultural fit's the most important.
It's not the most important, it's really important. So the thing is, you can, it doesn't mean homogenous, right? It doesn't mean that we all have to be the same to be a cultural fit. But it does mean that you have to have people, if you have 10 people in a room who have an incredible work ethic and really want to get things done and please a customer, and you get one person in here who's relatively apathetic to the whole situation, it has an effect on everybody. It changes the dynamic of an organization. So if you want an organization that's going to work or embody certain ideals, then you also need to be hiring for those ideals. And to me, those things are as important as whether or not somebody knows this particular skill or has it or can learn it. Plus, I'm a big believer that skill can be taught. I think some of it is about sort of core capability that I'm trying to assess.
So it sounds like for you, hiring the wrong person can be a big mistake. What are some of the biggest mistakes when you look back at your career that you've made, or things that you would have done differently, or things that maybe almost closed down the company?
Would you like ones from today or just in general? Bad hires, right? And that's probably why I'm not even slightly overcompensating for this now. But bad hires have cost me more money than anything ever will. And they're huge. Huge revenue loss, huge time loss, everything that goes into it. So a bad hire is damaging to the organization, it's damaging to the brand, it's damaging to your bottom line. So I think a lot of my mistakes were there. I'm not even going to go back before the last version of this, because we'll just say those were all mistakes in one way or another. Probably not giving people power at the right times, being too shy to recognize when I was in the way, as opposed to, there's a fine line between being there for someone, supporting them, facilitating things, and being in the way. In retrospect, I think I was in the way and should have gotten the hell out a lot sooner in many, many cases. Also, probably not giving people authority and responsibility in pair. You can't have authority without responsibility, and you can't have responsibility for long without authority, or you just leave. Those are how those two things go. So they have to be given hand in hand, and not recognizing that is a huge mistake I've made a number of times in my career that I'm hoping to get better at.
Well, I appreciate you. I know it can be really hard to share mistakes that we've made. So let's end things on a positive note. What are some of the best things that you've done in your career, or things that you wish you would have done earlier, maybe?
So the part of recognizing that I shouldn't be the one to do all things, if I were going to start over again, if it were tomorrow, the first thing I would do in my plan would be I would be trying to figure out how to get to that point. This is not to say that on day one you can hire, a staff of people that are going to complement everything. That's not how it works. But one of my first targets would be, how can I get to the point where I can have that division of responsibility? Because to me, knowing my own faults, knowing what I do, I would have tried even faster to get to the right people who can complement me quicker.
And this is talking about having somebody running the business versus servicing clients.
Yeah, and it's not even just that. There's running the business and that, but there's also other responsibilities. There's people who are better with clients. There are people who are better with different aspects. It's understanding what the vision responsibilities are and putting them in place as soon as it's humanly possible. And this is weird for me saying, because I'm also a big believer in people that can work completely cross-functionally. Okay, but just because you can work cross-functionally and you can help out doesn't mean that you shouldn't understand what your responsibilities are. So building up those divisions of responsibilities sooner would have been a big thing. And some of the things I like that are successful that we would have done was really, and it sounds weird, but to say, focusing on those dollars initially makes a big difference. It's easy to, and I used to quote this all the time, right? Nobody has ever, made money by, trying to make money. You have to do something you do well. And that's true. Here's the thing. Without the dollar sign at the bottom, though, it's really hard to live anywhere. So you still have to kind of be able to balance those things. In your mind, you want to be passionate and you want to do things that you want to do and you want to accomplish, but you also have to be mindful of all those things that go into it. And it's too easy, especially when you're an entrepreneur, to get carried away with an idea and not recognize the larger picture. And the larger picture is that this is still an organization, which is supposed to be a business, and that it is charity work if you're just all sitting around working and not taking any money home. It's not actually a business. We can call it anything we want. If 3 of us sit in a room and nobody takes home a paycheck, it is not a business. So getting to the point where right off the bat, we plan for the fact that people are going to take home salaries. A lot of entrepreneurs start with the idea of, well, I don't have to pay myself for the first 6 months, for a year, for whatever it is. Yeah, okay, so again, you're planning a charity. You're not planning a business, okay? On day one, you need to be planning a scenario where this is how much I need to take, this is what I'm going to get paid, this is a reasonable expectation, because you have to have a plan that can work so that you can pay yourself and others. If you are not, then your plan is invalid. Start over. Think about how the plan's going to work. Don't go off and barrel into it, being able to make those concessions along the way. It ultimately doesn't work out and it doesn't help.
Thank you. So it sounds like, getting that division of responsibilities was key for you.
Paying myself,
And
also
paying
key.
yourself were key. Those
Very
are some of the
key.
two keys. And some of the things that you maybe would have done earlier on.
Absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing all your experiences with us, and let's give Michael a big round of applause.